And good afternoon. And we're going to start here in a minute. So hope you enjoy it. Talking about the calendar year 1945 and things that happened in 1945 that impacted your life and still probably impact your life until today. The atomic bomb dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The big three, Stalin, Roosevelt, Winston Churchill. That's February 1945. The big three would be reduced to Stalin by summer. Hitler, of course, Hirohito, Germany and Japan, Eisenhower. The Axis powers, that's Hitler and Mussolini. And this photograph, nobody knows who these people are. Nobody knows who these people are. The guy took the picture and forgot to find out or didn't ask what's their name. So we don't know who's in this picture. But it was in Times Square during the summer of 1945. Daffy Duck hitting Hitler over the head. The 1945 surrender by Japan. The Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was probably the beginning of the end of the Nazis. Battle of the Bulge, that was in Belgium, was Adolf Hitler's last major offensive in World War II against the Western Front. Hitler had a simple aim. He wanted to split the enemies and as they're driving towards Germany. The German troops' failure to divide Britain, France, and America paved the way for the victories for the Allies. And not enough has been mentioned about how Russia did a lot of or Soviet Union did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of defeating the Nazis. This Battle of the Bulge lasted 6 weeks, from December 16, 1944 through January 25th of 45. And obviously, it's the beginning and the end for Germany. Supposedly, Germany caught the Allies by surprise at the start. And they were kind of winning a little bit, but the general, Anthony McAuliffe, there was a call, hey, let's surrender. Hey, you guys surrender. We got you beat. You guys surrender. But the general, Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division, told the Germans, we're not surrendering. Actually, he only said one word to the Germans, nuts. And that was it. The Battle of the Bulge, according to the U.S. Defense Department, over 1 million Allied troops, including 500,000 Americans, fought in the Battle of the Bulge. 19,000 soldiers killed in action. 4,700 wounded, 2,300 plus were missing. About 100,000 Germans were killed, wounded, or captured. Now, the Bulge is important for one other reason in the United States in its history. There was some integration. It was the first time that black soldiers served with white soldiers in the same unit. Now, Truman would desegregate the armed forces around 1948. But Eisenhower needed men in 1944 and 1945. Most black soldiers served only in maintenance or service positions or in segregated units. But there were some shortages in troops, and Eisenhower needed the troops, so he decides to integrate the service for the first time. 2,000 black soldiers volunteered to go to the front. Churchill. Winston Churchill with his cigar. Winston Churchill would have a very interesting year in 1945. He would lead England throughout the war, but there would be an election in July. Winston Churchill, addressing the House of Commons following the Battle of the Bulge, said, this undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and will, I believe, regarded as an ever-famous American victory. And people are marching to Germany. The Holocaust. The Holocaust is first unveiled. Finding out, Auschwitz. On January 27th, the Soviet Red Army liberates Auschwitz and Birkenau concentration camps. In February, Churchill, a very frail-looking Roosevelt, if you look at Roosevelt, he does not look well at all, and Stalin meet in Yalta. They figured, hey, it's over. We just got to mop it up. We're going to beat the Germans. It's going to be over in Europe sooner than later. The Yalta Conference was a meeting of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. They would meet in February in the resort city of Yalta, located along the Black Sea coast of the Crimean Peninsula, which is in the news today because there could be heavy-duty fighting in that area between Russia and Ukraine soon enough. The big three Allied leaders discussed the post-war fate of the defeated Germany and the rest of Europe and what we're going to do with them. How the Soviets could enter the Pacific theater, which is not settled yet, against Japan, and the formation of the new United Nations and how it's going to work. The big three at Yalta agreed that they wanted Germany's unconditional surrender. That's it. That's all we want, is their unconditional surrender, and then we're going to get to work. We're going to divide it into 4 post-war occupation zones controlled by the US, Britain, French, and Soviet military forces. Even though de Gaulle is not at Yalta, the French are talking about, hey, we're going to do something here. The city of Berlin would also be divided into similar occupational zones. Meanwhile, it's not settled in the Pacific, but it's getting there finally. The Battle of Iwo Jima, and of course the famous picture of Iwo Jima. The Battle of Iwo Jima took place between February 19th and March 16th. The United States mounted an amphibious invasion of the island of Iwo Jima as part of the Pacific Campaign against Japan. It was a costly victory for the United States. The battle, one of the bloodiest in the history of the U.S. Marine Corps. Well, Franklin Roosevelt has been President of the United States since March 4th, 1933. He came in, he has a problem with the Depression in getting the American economy back to working. He's leaving, as he dies, with World War II on his hands. He's been Commander-in-Chief, World War II, since December 7th, 1941. And there he is. That's the World War II Museum in New Orleans, a picture I took 3 years ago when I was down there at Mardi Gras. And Roosevelt dies. Unfortunately, he doesn't tell Harry Truman, his vice president, exactly what's going on. On April 12th, Roosevelt dies, leaving Truman, the vice president in charge of the country, still fighting World War II. At his Warm Springs, Georgia retreat, Roosevelt sits in the living room with Lucy Mercer, the woman he had an affair with, stopped, and he's resuming the extramarital affair with her. 2 cousins are there. His dog, Falfa, and an artist by the name of Elizabeth Schattentoff, and then she's painting his portrait. At about 1 o'clock, the president complained of a terrible pain in the back of his head. Collapsed. 3:30, the doctors pronounced him dead. And Harry Truman, who 2 years earlier would never have ever thought that he was going to be president of the United States, suddenly is president of the United States. And here is Truman taking the oath. These are Truman's challenges, some of which he knows about, some of which he doesn't know about. In Europe, the Allied troops had reached the Rhine and the Elbe, and Adolf Hitler's Third Reich was crumbling. But the war is not over. The United States' relations with its British ally, Winston Churchill, were challenging. The Soviet ally, Joseph Stalin, were even worse than strained. In the Pacific, at this point, he's not sure what's going to happen. They're still fighting, and there are still big battles in the Pacific. In the greatest logistical achievement in the United States history, the United States is ready, and the Allies are about ready to move more than 1 million men with all their gear from Europe to the Pacific. And what they intended to do was have an invasion of Japan, which would start in November. Now, a friend of mine was telling me about his father, and his father was in Europe. And he was supposed to go ahead. His father was in some sort of intelligence. He was supposed to be part of this invasion. And he said, more than likely, from what his father told me, that I would not be speaking to him about this. He said this was an American kamikaze mission. if they would invade Japan in November. But fortunately for my friend, the Manhattan Project had come about. The United States is developing an atomic weapon. Truman's challenges, he doesn't know about this weapon. He has no idea. In New Mexico, a team of scientists with total government support and unlimited resources are working on a super weapon. Roosevelt never tells him about this super weapon. FDR kept his vice president in the dark about the Manhattan Project, about the bomb's development, and it wasn't until after Roosevelt died that Truman learned about the Manhattan Project. It was top secret. He had no idea. Meanwhile, in Europe, they're rushing, or some tanks are going through Germany. World War II in Europe begins to near its end. 77 years ago this month, the Allies are closing in on Berlin. Soviet army reached Berlin in the middle of April after making its way through Eastern Europe, liberating German concentration camps as it progressed to Germany. The United States would liberate concentration camps, Buchenwald, and Dachau. British troops liberated the Belsen concentration camp. That's where Anne Frank died. And that's where her diaries were discovered in 1945, which would ultimately lead to the Diary of a Young Girl, or Anne Frank's diaries. They found no running water, thousands of dead and rotting corpses. A massive air raid using incendiaries completely destroyed the city of Dresden. And Eisenhower wants documentation, because Eisenhower thought in the future, and it's come to be in some cases, that nobody would believe that there was such a thing as the Holocaust. And he wanted to make sure that people saw pictures and knew about the Holocaust. Seeing the Nazi crimes committed at Ohrdruf made a powerful impact on General Dwight Eisenhower, and he wanted the world to know what happened at the concentration camps. On April 19th, he cabled General George C. Marshall with a request to bring members of Congress and journalists to the newly liberated camps so they could convey the horrible truth about Nazi atrocities to the American public. It's what Eisenhower said. The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations as merely propaganda. 77 years later, Eisenhower was correct. People don't believe there was a Holocaust. The end is near for Hitler. There is Hitler. By the end of April, it was clear that Nazi Germany would fall and the Allies would only accept an unconditional surrender. Hitler and several other high-ranking members of the Nazi leadership committed suicide moments before the Soviet Union reached their bunkers and Germany surrendered at the beginning of May. May 8th, VE Day in Europe. Nobody celebrates VE Day anymore. I mean, it may be listed somewhere, today's the anniversary of VE Day, but nobody celebrates it anymore. After all, it was 77 years ago. World War II in Europe comes to an end. As the news of Germany's surrender reached the rest of the world, joyous crowds gathered to celebrate in the streets, clutching newspapers that declared victory in Europe, VE Day. The war is not over. The war is continuing in Japan. It's not over yet. The Battle of Okinawa. Now, in the past, I had people who told me that they were at the Battle of Okinawa or at the Battle of Iwo Jima or somewhere in the Pacific or European theater. The Battle of Okinawa would be the last major battle of World War II. On April 1st, the Navy's 5th Fleet, more than 180,000 Army and Marine Corps troops descended on the Pacific island of Okinawa. This, the final push toward Japan. In the Pacific theater, however, American forces were still painstakingly conquering Japan's home islands, one after another. After obliterating Japanese troops in the brutal Battle of Iwo Jima, they set their sights on the isolated island of Okinawa, which would be their last stop before reaching Japan. The Battle of Okinawa put Allied forces within striking distance of Japan. 7,000 Japanese soldiers would surrender. Others would kill themselves, suicide. When faced with the reality that further fighting was futile, the General Uchi Jima and his Chief of Staff, General Cho, committed ritual suicide on June 22nd, 1945. Benito Mussolini, he's just hanging around, Mussolini. Doesn't have much to do, he's dead, so he's hanging around upside down. When World War II broke out in 1939, Mussolini said, I'm going to stay neutral. But when he saw Hitler's Germany make significant territorial gains, he entered the war on the side of Germany. As the tide of the war turned, the support for Mussolini in Italy began to decline, and he was arrested in 1943. But the German military rescued him. They enabled him to escape, and he becomes the ruler of a puppet republic in northern Italy. By 1945, Germany had lost the war. Allied forces poured into Italy. Mussolini tried to escape to Spain, but was intercepted, caught, and executed. Well, the next meeting is in Potsdam, and there is Truman, and there is Stalin. And it starts out with Winston Churchill being there. It ends with Winston Churchill not being there. As British citizens, there's a vote, and they say to Churchill, thanks for leading us through the war in Europe. Enjoy your pension. We don't want you anymore. The final Allied Leadership Conference takes place in Germany between July 17th and August 2nd. The Soviet leaders, Stalin, Harry Truman's there, and also Churchill. Churchill's not going to stay very long. They meet to discuss the end of World War II, Europe, and how to deal with the post-war reconstruction in Europe at Potsdam. Germany had surrendered in May, and it was decided before that there'd be 4 occupied zones, and the country would be completely demilitarized. Borders between Germany and Poland and the Soviet Union readjusted. Well, that's the beginning of the meeting. The meetings end with this guy shaking hands, a new British Prime Minister by the name of Clement Attlee. He might have been one of the big 3 on the global stage, but Winston Churchill was not exactly popular at home in England. On July 26, Churchill and his party were soundly defeated at the polls, with Labour easily defeating Churchill's Conservative Party. Churchill is gone. Attlee is in. The new Prime Minister would take Churchill's spot in Potsdam. Churchill had led the nation through its darkest hour and guided it to victory in Europe, only to be thrown out of office. Of the original big 3 that met in Yalta in February, Stalin is the last man standing. Meanwhile, there's this guy, Charles de Gaulle. He's not in Potsdam. He's not in Yalta, but he is running France. On August 26, 1944, following the Allied invasion of France, de Gaulle entered Paris in triumph. In November, he was unanimously elected provisional president of France. But de Gaulle is not part of the Yalta Conference. After the French premier, Henri Pétain, signed an armistice with Nazi Germany in June 1940, de Gaulle fled to London, where he organized Free French forces and rallied French colonies to the Allied cause. His forces fought successfully in Northern Africa. My father-in-law spent time in Northern Africa back in the war, and he was a member of the Single Corps. And in June 1944, he was named the head of the French government in exile. The atomic bomb was dropped by this plane, the Enola Gay. This plane sits in a museum now outside of Dulles Airport in Virginia, Northern Virginia, about 35 miles northwest of Washington, D.C. It's been all shined up, and you could look at it if you really wanted to. In this museum, which I did, the Enola Gay. The bomb's almost ready to go. It's almost ready to go. There were 70 scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project, and they signed a petition pleading, Truman, don't use it. don't really use it. Think about it. Think about it. Because it's going to cause a lot of damage. But their letter never went to Truman. And my friend is very happy that it never went to Truman, because he's here today. Because he said, because the bomb was dropped on Japan, 2 bombs were dropped on Japan, his father was able to come home. And his father lived a long life into his 90s. And he was obviously very happy that his father was able to escape the Allied invasion, planned Allied invasion in November. Atomic bomb. It's August 6th. A B-29 bomber known as the Enola Gay drops an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. It's the first time the bomb has ever been used in warfare. Seconds after the detonation, the estimated temperature was somewhere between 5,400 and 7,200 degrees Fahrenheit at ground zero. Almost everything within a mile of ground zero was destroyed by the blast and heat waves. Within an hour, a black rain of highly radioactive particles started falling on the city, causing additional radiation exposure. Another picture of the atomic bomb. The city was leveled. Less than 10% of the buildings were left undamaged by the bomb, according to the U.S. Department of Energy. The second bomb would be on Nagasaki. Kind of wondered why Nagasaki. Hiroshima was a target, but Nagasaki, maybe not as important, but the bomb was dropped there. August 9th, the bomb's dropped on Nagasaki. Japan's ready to surrender. That's what the atomic bomb will play. Why Hiroshima? Well, simple. Hiroshima was a major Japanese military hub. Factories, military bases, ammunition facilities. Historians say that the U.S. picked it as a suitable target because of its size and its landscape, and they didn't firebomb the city ahead of the bomb, so American officials could accurately assess the impact of the atomic bomb. Why Nagasaki? It's a good question. It was a shipbuilding center for the Japanese, and the U.S. forces planned to bomb it on August 11th, but there was bad weather, so they pushed it forward. Obliterates Nagasaki as well. Japan surrenders. It's the end of the war. Not officially, though. The war doesn't end officially until way later. And there's one open part of World War II that's never been resolved. Anyway, September 2nd, formal surrender documents signed between Japan and the United States on the USS Missouri, designating the day as the official victory over Japan. A lot of people know this picture, right? Right? Famous picture, right? Absolutely famous picture. Recreated in Key West. That's Key West, Florida. That's 4 years ago. Yeah, there they are. Statue. Who are these people? Well, you know what? We'll probably never know. I'm a journalist. That's what I do for a living. And I make sure that whoever I interview, and I don't take pictures, but I interview people. I get their name on, used to be tape, write their name down, get their spelling correct. So I know who it is. If I'm doing a radio report and I interview someone, I'm not going to say, well, here's the interview, I don't know who it is. But apparently, the Life magazine photographer who took the picture didn't bother to ask these people, what's your name? What are you doing in Times Square? There is some thought that this guy, Glenn McDuffie, was the guy in the picture. There have been a whole bunch of people claiming they were the guys in the picture, a whole bunch of women who claimed that they were the woman and it was not welcomed by them. But we never found out who the woman really was. The people claim that it was. The iconic picture could be Glenn Duffy kissing someone in New York's Times Square on VJ Day, August 14th. McDuffie's claim that he was the man and the iconic World War II picture was backed up by a Houston, Texas police forensic artist. Well, yeah, I mean, he was an artist, but was it McDuffie? Life magazine, which published the picture, has never verified the identity of the sailor or the nurse. The picture was taken by a guy by the name of Alfred Eisenstadt, who forgot one of the very basic questions of journalism, which includes who, what, where, how, why. Never asked. So he never got the names. So we never know really who those two people are, and we will never know who those people are throughout history. People have come forward but can't prove it. Meanwhile, there was a guy, I did this talk a couple of weeks ago, and I started talking about rationing. And there was a guy who was born in 1945, and he was telling me about when he was in the hospital being born and all the things that his parents had to go through because they were rationing while he was being born in 1945. Another woman who was about 88 years old told me she remembered rationing. She remembered not being able to get chocolate. She remembered blackouts, and that you used to have little books if you wanted to get sugar. Anybody remember that? You remember that?
Sure.
Rationing? So you couldn't get candy.
I remember the sugar.
Yeah, well,
Silk stockings.
silk stockings, nylons, and those things. Rationing, warning, punishment ranging from as high as 10 years imprisonment or $10,000 fine or both may be imposed under United States statutes for the violations thereof arising out of infractions of rationing orders and regulations. This book may not be transferred. It must be held and used only on behalf of the person to whom it has been issued. Anyone presenting it thereby responds to the Office of Price Administration and Agency of the United States government that is being so held and so used. For any misuse of this book, it may be taken away from the holder by the Office of Price Administration. In the event either of the departure from the United States of the person to whom this book is issued, or his and her death, the book must be surrendered in accordance with regulations. Any person finding a lost book must deliver it promptly to the nearest rationing board. It was serious stuff, real serious stuff. United States government between 1942 and 1945 limited the amount of certain goods that a person could purchase: gasoline, butter, sugar, canned milk, or ration. They needed it for the war effort. The war also interrupted or disrupted trade, limiting the availability of some goods, like rubber. The Japanese Imperial Army controlled the Dutch East Indies, or Indonesia, from March of 1945 to March of 1942 to December of 1945. That created production of rubber in the United States. And there you were. You went to the well, they didn't have supermarkets in those days. They had little food stores in those days. And there you are presenting your rationing book, and you're getting your rations or your products. Americans first received rationing cards March of 1942. The first ration card, number one, became known as the sugar book, for one of the commodities Americans could purchase with their ration cards was sugar. Other ration cards developed as the war progressed. Ration cards included stamps with drawings of airplanes, guns, tanks, aircraft, ears of wheat and fruit, which were used to purchase rationed items. And the Warner Brothers cartoons made fun of rationing. A cartoon. This is a movie with the gremlin, and Bugs Bunny is in it with the gremlin. And you know, gremlins were problems, right? They caused all sorts of problems. They're in the helicopter, in the plane, and they're about ready to crash, and they don't crash. They just stop right before they hit the ground. And Bugs Bunny takes out the carrot and says, well, you know how it is with these A cards. Couldn't get gas, right? You're rationed. They ran out of gas, so they didn't have a crash. I gotta explain that to my 2-year-old daughter one day when she watches this cartoon, because this is going to go way over her head until I explain it. And it's going to be a lengthy explanation, as you can see. The Office of Price Administration rationed automobiles, tires, gasoline, fuel oil, coal, firewood, nylon, silk, shoes. Americans used ration cards and stamps to take a meager share of household staples including meat, dairy, coffee, dried fruits, jellies, jams, lard, shortening, and oils. Do you remember all that? So your mother and father, or your mother had to make do with what she had. How many of you lived through the blackouts? They blacked out areas because they thought that, you know, if there was one of the Axis planes coming to the East Coast, New York, or the West Coast, Seattle, this doesn't make sense. Blackout 5 a.m. till dawn. It makes no sense because in the summer, the sun comes up in New York at 5:26. So what do you have, a blackout for 26 minutes? I think they meant 5 p.m. Till dawn. Officials in some American coastal cities were well aware of their vulnerability to air attacks and began ordering practice blackouts long before December 7, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. On March 8, 1941, Seattle would become the first major American city to test out its blackout procedures. I did this talk a couple weeks ago, and there was a woman who got a little upset at me. She said, it was a good talk, except you forgot one thing. I said, what's that? She says, my mother was one of those Rosie the Riveters. How many of you had mothers who were Rosie the Riveters? People who worked in munitions and other things because the men were gone. Rosie the Riveter, we could do it. That's Norman Rockwell had an exhibit down on a museum off Central Park West in the 90s. I forgot what it's called. It's some New York City museum. And Rosie the Riveter was part of the Norman Rockwell exhibit in the museum. Rosie the Riveter was the star of a campaign aimed at recruiting female workers for defense industries during World War II. And she became perhaps the most iconic image of working women. And there were women who went into the armed forces, the WACs, of course. American women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during the war. Between 1940 and 45, the female percentage of the U.S. workforce increased from 27% to nearly 37%. And by 1945, nearly 1 out of every 4 married women worked outside the home. This is Norman Rockwell's Rosie the Riveter. Who was Rosie the Riveter? Well, maybe it was Naomi Parker Fraley, who was photographed working in a machine shop at the Naval Air Station in Alameda, California, outside of Oakland, San Francisco. She could be Rosie. In a 1942 photo, she is sported wearing a polka-dotted bandana, but nobody knows for sure who Rosie really was. It could be a combination of a bunch of women. One of the Rosies allegedly lived on Long Island. But the call for women to join the workforce during World War II was meant to be temporary, and the women were expected to leave their jobs after the war ended when the men came home. This is Chrysler. Chrysler turned out cars, but they're turning out tanks. The war is over. What's going to happen now? How do you transform from an economy that's war-based to an economy that's in peacetime? With the end of the war, America has to end the war economy and look to the future. What are you going to do with the GIs who are returning? It's not fair just to throw them aside. They put their lives on the line for America during the war. So you have to do something for them, and starting in 1944, people were looking, we're going to have to do something with these guys. The United States businesses at the time were still geared to producing tanks and planes, not clapboard houses or refrigerators. And most economists thought that these companies couldn't turn it around. They thought, some economists said, there's going to be massive unemployment and inflation. Private businesses couldn't possibly generate the massive amounts of capital necessary to run the pumped-up wartime factories during peacetime. Economists were wrong. Returning home. What's going to happen when these guys return home? A report released in mid-1945 by the Senator James Meade of New York claimed that if the war in the Pacific ended too quickly, let's go and do the invasion in November, the United States would find itself largely unprepared to overcome unemployment on a large scale. But most returning veterans had no problems returning home. U.S. factories had proven so essential, to the wartime effort, quickly mobilized for peacetime. And they met the needs of consumers who had been encouraged to save up your money during the war, because you'll be able to spend it soon enough. Operation Magic Carpet starts on September 6, 1945. If you look at a graph, guys start coming home on September 6, 1945. The baby boom starts in June of 1946, 6 months later. It's like this, and then boom, all of a sudden, in June, the baby boom. But the baby boom really started. How many baby boomers are in here? People born after 1946. I'm one. Operation Magic Carpet commenced on September 6, 4 days after VJ Day, and it ended on September 1st, 1946. On average, Operation Magic Carpet brought back 22,222 Americans every day for nearly 1 year straight. You do the math and you can figure out when the baby boom really starts in June of 1946. Then there were war brides. My wife might have not been here had my father-in-law married somebody he met in England who couldn't get over to the United States because she wanted to bring her mother over. And this woman let him know that she was coming with her mother, and my father-in-law quickly married somebody else. And that's why I have the wife I presently have for the last 40 years. Could have been different. War Brides Act. December 28th, the War Brides Act took effect, allowing spouses of service personnel into the country without counting against federal immigration quotas at the time. The American Legion claimed a victory in the fight for legal admission to the United States, and 66,000 GI brides of World War II ended up living in America. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Lesbian-Born Children or the group ABBA. It's one of the women from the group ABBA. 1970s, the big group ABBA sung Mamma Mia and Dancing Queen, among other things. Before I get to the ABBA member, the Lesbian-Born Children. The German children, offspring of Norwegian mothers and German soldier fathers, the result of a Nazi plan to enrich the Aryan gene pool. Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, wanted to create the master race. And the picture there was Anna Frigg Lindstad of ABBA, one of the A's of ABBA. She was born on November 15, 1945, as a result of a liaison between her mother, Sydney, and a German sergeant by the name of Alfred Haas. The infant's mother and grandmother were branded as traitors in northern Norway, and ostracized in the village. They were forced to emigrate to Sweden. Anna Frigg's mother died of kidney failure before her daughter was 2 years old. Most of the Lesbian-born children stayed in Norway, and they were considered social misfits. Few ever received proper education. Few were ever employed. Now, had Germany won the war, they almost would have certainly been greeted as heroes, but Germany lost, and soon afterwards the Norwegian mothers lost their status, and their children were classified as rats by government officials. The United Nations would start in 1945. Representatives of 50 nations met in San Francisco between April and June of 1945 to complete the Charter of the United Nations. The United Nations comes into existence on October 24th after 29 nations ratified the Charter. The Nuremberg Trials. You would figure thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Nazis would be tried at the Nuremberg Trials. As it turns out, only a handful of Nazis were ever tried. They start in 1945. The Nuremberg Trials broke new ground in holding government leaders individually responsible for their aggression and slaughter of millions of innocent people, in addition to establishing the offense of war crimes It also produced charges of crimes against peace, waging war against the aggression and crimes against humanity. The best known of the Nuremberg Trials was the trial of major war criminals that begins on November 20th. There were prosecutors and defense attorneys according to the British and American law, but the decisions and sentences were imposed by a tribunal or a panel of judges rather than one single judge or a jury. Meanwhile, North Vietnam. Did America make a mistake in 1945 in North Vietnam? That would haunt America for 3 decades. Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence on September 2nd. Vietnam had been a French colony before World War II started, but France fell to Germany in 1940, and the Japanese seized control of Vietnam, but they told the French officials, you take care of the country. It was Cambodia, it was Laos, it was Vietnam, Indochina. So Ho Chi Minh is making an appeal to Harry Truman. He desperately wants U.S. support in this independence declaration. And he's giving this talk, borrowing from Thomas Jefferson. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He wants Truman's attention. He never gets it. Jackie Robinson signed a contract with the Brooklyn Dodgers in October 1945. In early 1945, Jackie Robinson was signed by the Negro League team, the Kansas City Monarchs. He's out of the Army at this point, and he starred. He hit .387. Baseball was his worst sport, by the way. He was much better in track and field, football, and basketball. The Brooklyn Dodgers, any old Brooklyn Dodger fans in here? You're giving me that look like, how dare I say Brooklyn? What fan?
How dare you?
Which?
American League.
Oh, you're a Yankee fan.
Yeah.
You rooted for U.S. Steel, because they won every year.
He celebrated just recently,
Last week?
just 2 days ago. I think.
No, last Friday, a week ago today. Jackie Robinson's 75th anniversary. In fact, I gave a talk somewhere today about that. 75th anniversary. Anyway, Branch Rickey's was scouting the Negro Leagues, looking for players who not only had talent, but the demeanor to withstand the pressures associated with integrating baseball. Rickey interviews Jackie Robinson, and he makes this demand. When you're on the receiving end of racial abuse, you cannot respond. Robinson reportedly said, are you looking for a Negro who's afraid to fight back? To which Rickey responded, no, I'm looking for a person with guts enough not to fight back. Rickey would sign Jackie Robinson, who would be in the major leagues in April 1947. This woman's a Native American, or First Nations. Her name, Elizabeth Petrovich, and she's in Alaska, United States territory. She and her husband, Roy, Tigland natives, Native Americans, and they spot a sign in late 1941 in Douglas, Alaska, across the water from downtown Juneau. By the way, you cannot get into Juneau except by plane or boat. No roads lead into Juneau, which is the state capital of Alaska. And it was the last shore. The two had grown up in segregated Alaska, separate schools, hospitals, theaters, restaurants, cemeteries. And she helped pass an anti-discrimination law that she pushed for. She testified about the second-class treatment of Alaskan natives and how that affected her children and others in her community. Her testimony before a territorial legislative body, February 5th, convinced lawmakers to act. They signed the legislation. Governor Ernest Grunig signs the bill into law on February 16th, the legislation entitled All Alaskans to Full and Equal Enjoyment of Public Establishments, setting a misdemeanor penalty for violators. Also banned discrimination signage based on race, like no blacks allowed, no Jews, no dogs allowed, although that sign may have been exaggerated at the Kenilworth Hotel that Arthur Gottfried owned in Miami Beach. No natives allowed. There's a plane crash, at the Empire State Building on July 28th. A US B-52 bomber accidentally hit the Empire State Building. 14 people were killed. The bomber crashed into the 79th floor. The building obviously survived because you step outside here, go up a little high, to a high land, you'll see the Empire State Building. Well, you kind of see it. They built so many taller buildings, like that one on 57th Street, the Pencil Building. It just looks like a rectangle. It just goes up. Horrible. It doesn't look like the Chrysler. The Chrysler Building looks nice, doesn't it? It's a grand building. Now you got all these pencil buildings going up that look like boxes. They just go up, up, and up. How many of you own the Slinky? Anybody own the Slinky, or your kids or your grandkids? Slinky, the Slinky. It's a great toy. I don't know why people liked it. I used to just see it walk down the steps. Slinky, Swedish word meaning stealthy, sleek, sinuous, debuts. The Slinky has 67 feet of steel in it. It was invented by a mechanical engineer by the name of Richard James, who was working for the military in his home. He dropped the spring and it slinked off the tabletop and some books, and he said, "Hey, what an idea for a toy. It'll keep people occupied." Still not sure why it keeps kids occupied. How many of you actually did a Slinky once? I mean, I still don't get it. Three Musketeers candy. How many of you like Three Musketeers? Well, in 1945, there was a change. Originally, it came 3 pieces to a package. 1 chocolate, 1 strawberry, 1 vanilla. But this changes during World War II because the strawberry and the vanilla flavors are just too expensive. So it became all chocolate. Three Musketeers still a sold. The longest version of Abbott and Costello's Who's on First came out in 1945 in the movie The Northern 90s. And that is the longest rendition of the Who's on First routine. Frank Sinatra got involved in the civil rights movement in 1945. Frank Sinatra, seated with hands on the table, meets with Gary, Indiana high school students in 1945 in an effort to dispel a strike, protest of racial integration at Froebel High School. On November 2nd, Sinatra canceled a $10,000 gig, which now would be something like $250,000. And he goes to Gary, Indiana. He's there to tell high school students, go back to school. No big deal about integration. Sinatra called it the most shameful incident in the history of American education. Ebony magazine hits the stands in 1945, a pictorial magazine published in Chicago by the Johnson Publishing Company. It hits the newsstands, created by John H. Johnson. It celebrated African American life and culture by depicting the achievements of Black Americans. It honored Black identity by portraying Black life and refuting stereotypes. Now, did any of you grow up in the Bronx whose parents might have known Bess Meyerson's parents? You did? You did? Did you know Bess Meyer, or were you somebody in your family?
I know of it.
Oh, you knew of them.
I don't know of it yet.
Yeah. My wife's cousin, his grandmother grew up in the neighborhood, and they knew the Meyerson family. Bess Meyerson would be Miss America in 1945. She was the first Jewish Miss America. Unfortunately, in 1980, I never got a chance to interview her. She was running for Senate. And I was 23, 24 years old as a reporter, and I interviewed Al D'Amato, and I interviewed Javits people. Javits had Lou Gehrig's disease at the time, and was really out of it. But I interviewed his people. And I interviewed Carol Bellamy and Liz Holtzman and all the people who were involved in running for election that year for Senate in the state of New York. She ran, but I never got a chance to interview her. She competed in Atlantic City for the title of Miss America, and the director of the pageant said, you know, your name is a little too Jewish. Why don't you change your name? We'll hide the fact you're Jewish. No. Keeping my name. After she wins Miss America, she tours the country, and she encounters the No Jews sign, like the alleged no Jews, no dogs allowed in Kenilworth Hotel that Arthur Godfrey owned in Miami Beach. Many of the opportunities associated with being Miss America were not available to Bess Meyerson. But she accepted an offer from the Anti-Defamation League to speak on the lecture circuit. The title of her speech, "You Can't Be Beautiful and Hate." Remember I said there's an ongoing dispute that has not been settled from World War II that's still in play in March of 2022? It's between Japan and Russia, unresolved. They've never signed the peace treaty. After Russia invaded Ukraine in February, Russia decided to do something about the Kuril Islands dispute, also known as the Northern Territories dispute in Japan. In March 2022, the Russian military started a military exercise involving more than 3,000 troops on that chain of islands. Japan has claimed that the Soviet Union, now Russia, illegally seized the 4 islands after the surrender. Neither side has signed the peace treaty because of that dispute. World War II is not over yet. There is still the question of who owns these islands, and the Russians sent troops to these islands, and this is left over from World War II. The 1945 legacy, there's Hitler and there's Mussolini. 2018, new forensic study of remains by Russian intelligence for 7 decades determined that World War II, World War II was lost by Germany. Adolf Hitler killed himself in his Berlin bunker, April 30th, 1945. April 28, 1945, El Duce Benito Mussolini and his mistress Clara Pataki are shot by Italian partisans who captured the couple as they attempted to flee to Switzerland. Mussolini was hated. This is a museum in Lower Manhattan, and I went there about prior to COVID-19, basically to listen to a talk and go through the museum. And they talk about Nuremberg and why so many Nazis were not captured. Well, they don't talk about why so many Nazis weren't captured. The question was, why weren't the Nazis captured? 2021, the survey said 1 in 10 young Americans believe that the Holocaust never happened. 23% thought it's a myth, or that the number killed, the 6 million Jews, highly exaggerated. In a 50-state survey of Americans aged between 18 and 39, 12% said they never heard or thought they never heard the word Holocaust. Eisenhower was right. Hiroshima, 140,000 people probably died from the blast. They all didn't die immediately. They had issues over the years because of the radioactive fallout in the months and years later. The day after the Nagasaki bombing, Harry Truman issued his first affirmative command regarding the bomb. No more strikes without his express authorization. He never issued the order to drop the bombs. Never did. Somebody else did, but he issued the order to stop dropping the bombs. At St. Petersburg, Russia, when I was there 10 years ago. The end of World War II saw the United States and Soviet Union relationship crumble with the Cold War starting in 1946. 1,600 Nazi scientists and other researchers would move to America to work on defense programs in the space program, something called Operation Paperclip. The hunt for Nazis would become global, and Israel would get Eichmann in 1960. China, free of Japan, would see a civil war and become a communist country in 1949. There's Jackie Robinson, the Brooklyn Dodgers. Hirohito would survive, but other Japanese leaders did. Jackie Robinson would make his major league debut on April 15, 1947. America would support South Vietnam in 1955 in the Civil War. Ho Chi Minh could not get American support. Charles de Gaulle became the leader of the provisional French government, 44 to 46. He oversaw the end of World War II, helped France form a new government, left politics in 1946, came back in 1958, elected president of France. More than 360 million Slinkies have been sold since 1945. Three Musketeers, still on the market. Bess Meyerson went into showbiz, was a political activist, got caught in a scandal that ended her career. She's the only Jewish Miss America in the pageant's history. February 16th is Elizabeth Hirachevich Day in Alaska. The day that the Anti-Discrimination Act was enacted. It would be another 20 years or so before the Federal Civil Rights Act would be passed in 1964. 14 years before Alaska became a state, they passed an anti-discrimination law. That's a subway station in St. Petersburg. Soviet Union fell in 1991. Problems remain for the United States and its successor, Russia. Ebony went bankrupt in July 2020, purchased for $14 million by a former NBA player named Junior Bridgman. December 2020, relaunched as a digital magazine in 2021. One of the Rosie the Riveters, Helen Vaudrin, in her plane. She saw the plane many years later hanging in a museum. The women who did stay in the workforce continued to be paid less than their male peers and were demoted. But after their selfless efforts during World War II, women who enjoyed and thrived on the taste of financial and personal freedom decided they wanted more. And with that would eventually become the women's liberation movement. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? No?